Welcome back to the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, Executive Director at Denison Forum and host for today's conversation. We're going to have a really good time. I'm joined today by our Associate Editor and Denison Forum contributor, Mark Legg. Mark, say hello.
Hello. Good morning again.
Yeah, glad to have you back with us. And we're going to just try to clarify for our audience as well as our guest today. It's Mark and Mark the Younger. Not Mark the Greater, not Mark the Older, just Mark, that's me, and Mark the Younger, that's you, all right? And we're not going to tell anybody that I am actually old enough to be your dad, but that is the case. We'll move on. But today we're talking about an exciting opportunity. The movie called Jesus Revolution is releasing this week on February 23rd. And we are honored to have one of the key figures in making this project come alive, Jon Erwin with Kingdom Story Company, the founder and director of Kingdom Story. Let me just tell you a little bit about Jon, and then we'll get him to say hello. In 2002, Jon and his brother Andrew founded a production company, and the first things they got involved with were commercials, documentaries, and music videos for the likes of Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, Casting Crowns, Switchfoot, Skillet. They have received 11 GMA Dove Award nominations and 3 wins for Music Video of the Year. They also produced an award-winning documentary about 9/11 called The Cross and the Towers that hopefully people can find and connect to. In 2010, Jon and Andrew began exclusively developing dramatic feature film projects. In 2018, they partnered with Kevin Downs and Tony Young to launch Kingdom Story Company in an exclusive partnership with Lionsgate. Anybody goes to the movie sees Lionsgate often when they watch a movie. And they are creating life-changing content through a variety of talented storytellers, some of which you will recognize, I'm sure. Their features have all opened in top 10 box office, and they have received coveted A-plus cinema score 3 times. Early hits include October Baby, Mom's Night Out, Woodlawn, and many will recognize the surprise hit I Can Only Imagine, which I have an affection for a lot of reasons. So many of us love the song, but the story is based not far from where we are located in Dallas. That movie earned $86 million at the box office. They've also included other projects such as I Still Believe, the story of Jeremy Camp, and the Jesus music, as well as the Kurt Warner story, American Underdog, and the movie about Johnny Cash. Jon is also an author. He wrote the book Beyond Valor, a World War II story of extraordinary heroism, sacrificial love, and a race against time, which tells the amazing story of his grandfather, Red Erwin. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit if we have time, who is a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. Today, we want to talk about a lot of things, Jon, but we specifically want to spend most of our time talking about Jesus Revolution. But first of all, just welcome to the Denison Forum podcast, and thank you for letting us be a part of telling your story.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm like, that was the exhaustive bio, man. I forgot about that stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's I appreciate you having me, and it's a great privilege to be an entertainer. You know, it's wonderful to be able to tell stories, hopefully that matter. You know, they say every filmmaker finds their story and tells it over and over again. You know, and for us, starting with the movie Woodlawn, the common thread is just inspirational true stories, the power of the truth, the stories that, you know, the Bible says that they overcame in Revelation by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, you know, word of their story. And there's power in true stories. And so that has been the thread between documentaries on Johnny Cash and movies like I Can Only Imagine, or a book like Beyond Valor. It's just the power of true stories. Because you watch them and you're like, you know, if Kurt Warner could accomplish his dream and his calling, maybe I could. If Bart Millard could forgive his father, and if you know, if his dad could be transformed by the gospel, maybe that can happen to me and our family. And so those are the stories that we love, and it's an honor to tell them. And it's unbelievable it's an unbelievable privilege to get to work in any medium where your dreams come to life right in front of you. And so these things that we sort of see in our minds and write in a script, that all these hundreds of people come around us to make those things real. and then entertaining for an audience is just it's so cool. And so it's an honor to be here, and thanks for helping get the word out about Jesus Revolution.
Well, John, just thank you for what you do. My wife and I love going to the movies, and just one of the favorite things that we like to do. Really, we're bummed about it when, in the COVID pandemic of 2020, just couldn't go to the movie,
Yeah,
and grateful to be able to watch stuff at home. But just, there's just nothing like going
there's
to a
something
theater.
about it. Yeah.
My wife loves the popcorn, and man, just we just love the whole experience, getting out of the house, and just some things can't really be appreciated the way they should be unless you see them on the big screen. And I just love the way that you and your brother are redeeming the theater with really, really quality content that's safe to take your family to, and that's really, really well done. And that's certainly true of the movie we're going to talk about here in a moment. But I just want to thank you for what you're doing, using one of the most powerful ways of storytelling that we know about in our world, and just tell me a little bit of background about how did you get interested in movies in the first place?
Oh man,
What drew you into this part of the world?
well, um, I just God's providence and just a total accident. When I was born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, about as far from LA as you can get, and I was just curious. I'm a huge believer in curiosity, just sort of as a way to live life, and so I was apprenticing under. I was like an ADHD nightmare. I had to do kindergarten twice because I was an ADHD disturbance to the class. It wasn't my grades; it was literally everyone else's, and so I was apprenticing for a cameraman when I was 15, and in Alabama, there's lots of football, lots of televised football, obviously, and so a cameraman got sick about 3 hours before the kickoff of a University of Alabama game. So my mentor called me and said, "Get over here right now." I told him I knew a guy. Don't tell anyone how old you are. Don't tell anyone you've never done this before. And so my dad dropped me off like because I didn't even have my learner's permit at the time. He dropped me off like 4 blocks from the stadium, and I tried to talk in deep tones, and I just went and ran this camera for ESPN, and I had the time of my life. I mean, it was so cool to meet a vocational passion that early, and there was sort of life before that moment and life after that moment, like a kid that went and joined the circus. And I remember walking up to the oldest guy on that crew and saying, "How did you get this job? How did you get in this business?" Just with wide-eyed optimism, and he just said, "Bad luck, kid. Get out now." And he walked away, but I didn't listen to him. And the next year, my dad helped me buy a camera with money he didn't have. And it's probably the best gift I ever got. And he helped me get a loan for $10,000 for an editing system. And that was the beginning. And he just said, "Dream bold, dream big, dream the impossible." And, uh, and he's always been our biggest fan. And he also said, if you give 20 years of your life to something, you'll be successful. And I don't think many people think of it in those terms. And so basically, my brother and I, for years, just directed local, industrial videos, weddings. I've recorded 150 orthopedic trauma surgeries, and just whatever. And then Michael W. Smith gave us a break to let us do a music video for him. Amy Grant quickly followed, and then we found sort of our rhythm in doing music videos, and did them over and over and over again. And that was a gift because Malcolm Gladwell calls it in his book Outliers the 10,000-hour rule. And I think people don't really appreciate the time of preparation and sort of honing in a craft. And we were able to do that over the course of many years. And then it was in 2010, I went, and it's where I met Kevin Downs, who's our producing partner. I went and directed second unit on a movie called Courageous. It was being made by a church in Georgia, Sherwood Church, which is the Cinderella story. They were making films with Sony that were doing really, really well, but they wanted to do car chases, because it was a cop drama, and so you never want to combine that with church volunteers. People get run over. So I came in to do that stunt work, and those action sequences. And the first question Alex Kendrick asked me, the director of the film, he just says, "John, what's your purpose and the purpose of your work?" And I couldn't answer the question, couldn't stop thinking about the question, and that led to a career being fused with a calling. And there's nothing better vocationally than when you really strive to hone in a craft, and then you use that for something beyond yourself and for God's glory instead of your own. It's amazing. It's an amazing feeling. And so we started making our own movies and joined this little mini revolution that is Christian film and or faith-based film or whatever you want to call it,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
it's fun. I remember Sean Astin. I forget if I already mentioned this, but I remember Sean Astin said, "I see you guys as frontiersmen and pioneers. You and the Kendricks and Devon Franklin, Dallas Kendrick." And I said, "Thank you, Sean. That's such high praise." And then he said, "Most frontiersmen die out on the frontier, and so they
Yeah.
but we're gonna blaze a trail." And so it's so cool to work in anything that's sort of emerging,
Mm-hmm.
any industry that's sort of emerging, to think that you can sort of have your fingerprints on what it will become, and that is a privilege. And it's so cool to see each film get bigger, and studios take notice, and there's quite the there's quite the uprising on behalf of Christianity in Hollywood right now, and at all levels. And I think the audience will feel it more and more, as we move forward.
Yeah, we're just kind of wondering at Denison Forum has a big desire to see God bring the next spiritual awakening into this part of the world, and we're just wondering if that is going to happen in some ways through technology and through mediums like film. So we're hoping so. Let's talk a little bit specifically about this project. Jesus Revolution comes out here in a couple of days in theaters. Tell us the backstory of how you got onto this story and what made you want to make this film.
Well, it's the longest I've ever worked on a movie. It's the movie we've been trying to get made in between all the other movies. About 7 years ago, before the movie I Can Only Imagine, the first true story we made was Woodlawn, and it was set in the early '70s, and it was like a revival saved this high school, and I was like, is this true? Did this really happen? It almost seemed too good to be true. So I began researching the time, and I stumbled upon this. I've got it. This magazine. It's a Time magazine, 1971, and it's this psychedelic Jesus on the cover of Time, and Time called it the Jesus Revolution, and it was an article you couldn't read online, and so it was this 10-page spread that was beautiful. It was the most positive account of Christianity I'd ever read in a publication like Time. And it was this tidal wave of spiritual awakening that started in Southern California and then really swept the country and then crescendoed back into Dallas, Texas, actually, at this event called Expo 72. And I just immediately had the fear of missing out. I immediately was like, I felt gypped. I'm like, why has my generation not experienced anything like this? And I just became a student of the Jesus movement and of revivals in general. And honestly, you can't separate the story of America without the story of the revivals that have been in America all the way back to the Great Awakening, which preceded the American Revolution. And so I just got to know I just got to study it. I wanted to meet someone that lived it. So I'm compulsively curious. And so that's how I met Greg and Kathy Laurie. And we started talking about it, and I started doing interviews. And the more interviews I did, the more this word desperate came up. It was just a desperate time. It was a time so similar to the time that we're in right now. It's a very divisive time in American history. So we've been where we are before, and that's when God broke through. What do they say? When your pain outweighs your fear, change can begin. And that was a time where people just got desperate enough for God, and so I just felt like I really want to make a movie on this. And so what's funny is we've tried several times. Every movie we've been trying to, like, so I Can Only Imagine, I Still Believe, American Underdog. I've been trying to get basically enough credibility to get a studio to let us make a movie like Jesus Revolution. So the fact that
Mm.
Lionsgate, it's such a miracle and such a statement of trust that Lionsgate would let us make this movie with this title. And I'm very grateful. And I love the movie that we made. And God's timing is just perfect. We were about to roll cameras on this movie right when COVID shut everything down. But God just had a time and a plan for this movie. So to see the month that we're in right now, I was talking to Dallas Jenkins.
Hmm.
Um, a little side story. There was an event that culminated. The culminating event of the Jesus movement was an event called Expo 72 in Dallas, Texas. Now you guys are in Texas. and as is Dallas. And it was like somewhere between 100,000 and a quarter million young people converged on Dallas. Billy Graham was here, and it was in the Cotton Bowl, and it was like the seminal event of the Jesus movement. Um, and my parents were there. Uh, Dallas Jenkins' parents were
Mm.
there. They were so moved. That's why his name is Dallas. His wife Amanda's parents were there. So it was this generational event, you know. And so I was talking to him, and of course we become good friends. And Jonathan Rumi is in both his show, The Chosen, and in the movie Jesus Revolution. And we're like, we didn't plan it this way, but February has really become the month of Jesus, you know, in entertainment between The Chosen, Super Bowl commercials, and now you know, Jesus Revolution. And it's so cool to lock arms and work together to just get Jesus back into the conversation in a real and meaningful way, and to see that begin to happen and work. And then what we've all been praying for, you know, a couple weeks ago, or whenever it started, I was in Kentucky wrapping another movie, and it was like day two of this revival at Asbury.
Mm-hmm.
And through my study of the Jesus movement, I knew that Asbury, that very auditorium, Hughes Auditorium, was a big part of the Jesus movement in 1970, of what became the Jesus movement in the South. Um, and so I was like, my wife was with me, and I'm like, let's just go over and see what it is, you know, see what's going on. And it was like, you know, day two, or it was day three. You just walk right in, and we sat there and listened, and then Greg, to just these students talking about what God was doing in their lives and the way they were owning their time and their faith. It was so inspiring. And then Greg Laurie called me and said, what did it feel like? You know, and I said, it felt just like scenes we dramatized in the movie. Like, it felt so similar. So to see little shards of hope that this can and is happening again is the very reason why we made the movie. So all the times that we've tried to make this movie, I think God just had the perfect moment for this movie to come out. And so I love the fact that it's coming out, and I love the movie that we made. And we're entertainers first, and so we want to make you laugh and cry. And I've never made a movie where people cheered during the film before, and multiple times. But there really is a heartbeat and a movement behind this movie. If God can do this once, maybe He can do it again, and maybe this can happen again in our time, and that's why we made it.
Yeah, that's good. And that's exciting too. And I'm curious as to what you attribute to obviously God's hand, God's providence, bringing all these things together at the same time. But I'm curious about how you got connected to Lionsgate and how that happened, and even seeing The Chosen kind of break any record by a mile for crowdfunded film, like crowdfunded TV shows and those kinds of things. Do you think that Hollywood is paying more attention to it just because there have been more successful films recently, this kind of Christian cohort? And what do you attribute to that success, and how did you convince Lionsgate, or how did that connection happen, to do this film?
Well, I still don't quite know. I mean, we did some things right, and I'm so grateful for the support of the audience. I think it was the overwhelming success of I Can Only Imagine that got us in business with Lionsgate, and led to a partnership and a deal. And I love that studio. There's many believers at that studio, and they're innovative and entrepreneurial. And again, the fact that they would make us make a movie called Jesus Revolution is just a total miracle. And the fact that in this environment they would put it wide in theaters nationwide, that's a total miracle. And it's such a statement of trust. And there's so many wonderful people there, but it really is the support of the audience. Like, when we unify our voice, we're in a moment in entertainment. This will end up being the most disruptive moment in the history of movies and television, what has been COVID. And what it did is it just accelerated change. So 10 years of change happened in a year. And so what happens is studios get really desperate, when that happens, for anything that works, any sure bet, because there's so many unknowns. So when we show up as an audience and champion a product together, they will make more of that. Like, there's no more, sort of like, well, we're gonna sit on our ideological high horse and not make the stuff. If it works, they'll make it. Whether that's horror films or superhero films or faith-based films. And so I think that we just have a unique opportunity in an industry. And I also think there's so many changes in the content in Hollywood. There's a lot of people under the hood that have been silently people of faith, saying, "I just can't. I have to reconcile my values to my career." And so there's this uprising on behalf of faith and values again in Hollywood, which is really cool to see, to be a part of. And so I just think the timing is right. And I think timing is everything. But there is a lot going on. There's more going on in the industry than any time in my career on behalf of Christianity. And I think over the next few years, you're going to feel it more and more. And at the highest levels of the industry, the most well-known actors to the business analytics people and the financial engineers, and there's just there's and studio executives. There's quite the there's quite the return to form. And so it's cool to see us get back to something. I think, as I mentioned, we had the premiere of this movie at the Chinese Theater, and first movie to premiere there was DeMille's King of Kings. So
Wow.
it's cool to try to get back to 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 something that was substantive in Hollywood a long time ago, and try to retake that mountain or be a small part of doing that. So there's great things going on, but even then, the fact that they let us make a movie called Jesus Revolution about the last great revival in America, and the fact that it's coming out right now, that's something only God could have done. And the fact that Dallas and I didn't sit down and like, your thing's gonna, it's like, your product's gonna end 3 weeks before our product comes out, and we're gonna make sure we have Super Bowl commercials that have the name of Jesus in the middle, and like, we're gonna plan all that. Like, we didn't do any of that. It just sort of happened all in the month of February, and it's really cool to see, that there's a three-chord strand's not easily broken. That these things are happening all at the same time. And I, of course, love The Chosen. I love Jonathan in The Chosen. That's why I cast him in this movie. And I think season 3 is the best season. I think the end of season 3 is so incredible, with what they dramatized. And so it's just really cool to use technology. Paul said of David in Acts that he served the purposes of God in his generation. The technology that we have and things like mass entertainment, which is America's second largest export, they present us with more opportunities to sort of get the message out, to share the gospel, than every generation before us combined of Christians. So let's use this. Let's use it, and let's change our attitude a little bit. Jesus said to Peter, "On this rock I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Or you know, a gate's not a weapon. Nobody's going to throw a gate at you. Gates are meant to be stormed, and that should be our attitude. And I think we've taken a much more defensive, fearful posture, instead of saying, "Let's get back in the game. Let's." And I've just found in LA a horrific lack of representation for Christianity, and I actually think that's our fault. That's not LA's fault, and I think it's time we take a different attitude, and we own our time, and we own the
Yeah.
tools of our time in a powerful way. For us, we couldn't do it without trying to make the best movies that we can make, but when the audience supports them, that's what allows us to make more of them.
And
Yeah,
and it's
and so great to watch how that happens, and maybe we're seeing some signs of that with just some fresh movements of God, like you said, with Ashbury
Mhm.
Seminary or College, and just some things going on to like retake some of the entertainment industry, as you said. I have a friend
Yeah.
here in Dallas who has a daughter in LA trying to make it in the entertainment industry, and she just decided to invite some friends over just to have a spiritual conversation, ask her dad to come out and kind of help her with it. It's turned into a regular group that meets, a couple of times a month, probably between 40 and 60 people in the entertainment industry who bring a lot of baggage and a lot of
Mhm.
brokenness.
It's so
But
great.
he
Yeah.
he gets to go out and just spend time with them. They've seen people come to faith and come back to faith and that type of thing. One of the things, John, I just really am curious about is, I've followed the entertainment career of Kelsey Grammer for
Yeah.
decades now. I'm old enough to go all the way back to the Cheers days that Mark
Yeah.
probably doesn't know
Yes.
anything of what I'm talking about. And thank you for plugging The Chosen. I got to have some time with Dallas Jenkins, got to meet him a few months ago. And I would just tell our audience, look, the only way you can really appreciate the end of season 3 of The Chosen is to see it in a theater. to see how that season ends on a big screen was just fabulous. But how did it come about? Like I said, there's not a Christian conspiracy here to take over the month of February, but God orchestrated some of these pieces to come together with The Chosen season 3 and He
Mhm.
Gets Us, and now with Jesus Revolution. But how do you get somebody like Kelsey Grammer involved in a project like this?
That's a great question. And first of all, the end of season 3 is spectacular. I was watching, I guess I'm allowed to say it now because it's out. The Walking on Water is the end of season 3, and they kept it a big secret. And I was watching every iteration on like Dallas's iPhone and Akis's, the cinematographer who also is the cinematographer from Jesus Revolution, on his iPhone, and seeing the visual effects come in, and it is awe-inspiring and staggering. It's so good. And emotional. And you're right, we did not plan this conspiracy. It was literally God said, "This is when I want these projects to come out." And again, I just think God had a plan, and it's so cool. It's like we make our plans, God directs our steps, and it's so cool to just feel like people did feel in the Jesus movement, in the Jesus Revolution, just a part of something. Like it's not about one thing; it's about the culmination of things. It's so cool. Kelsey Grammer he's Kelsey Grammer. I mean, he's a national treasure, is what he is. But when you can be Frasier and Macbeth, that is range as an actor. But he's also, as he said on both Fallon and especially when he really broke down, and started crying with Ryan Seacrest and Kelly, doing press for the movie, uh, he just had this crisis of meaning in his life, and he really wanted to do something meaningful. And he said the script came the next day, and he felt it was a sign. And he is so curious and so spiritually hungry, and had just gave himself to the role, loves the movie, and God's just working in his life. And I love him. He's one of the most kind and generous people I've ever had the privilege to work with, but he's also one of the most incredibly talented actors I've ever
Mm-hmm.
gotten the chance to work with. And he gives such an unbelievable performance in the film. Um, portraying this pastor that on a dare from his daughter throws his doors open to the church and of his church to the hippies. And which at the time, a hippie coming to church was like, here's your path, like go home, run away, take a bath, cut your hair, get a job, rejoin society. Now maybe we'll let you back in the church. And he just said, no, you come as you are, come right now. And there was so much power in that. And I remember Greg saying that when he met Lonnie Frisbee, it was like nitro meeting glycerin, and they were quite the team for a very short time. But that spark is what lit the flame of the Jesus movement. And and so Kelsey just really dedicated himself to the role. And I remember he came to Greg's SoCal Harvest event, and I was with him up in the press box. And Greg preached and gave the invitation, and then we couldn't find Kelsey. I thought he went to the bathroom, and he and his daughter, they were down on the field, and just responding and just smiling and crying, and it was just this wonderfully beautiful moment. And it really is a project that has been very meaningful to him, and I love working with him and would do it again in a heartbeat. And he's just, you know, he had insight into the part that I didn't even see, and he crushes it in this movie. And I'm so grateful to have had the privilege to work with him.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me really excited to see it. And as someone who, as a young person in our culture right now, Mark and I have done a lot of work into looking into Generation Z and kind of that cohort of people who are coming up, going to be, many of us are already adults and then will continue to become adults. I wonder, as we think back about the 60s and 70s, there was such an uncertain time. It was
Yeah,
so turbulent in the culture. I mean, I think when we look at what we're in today, it feels like this is the most turbulent a culture could ever be. But arguably, it's been even more turbulent in the past, like you talked about.
correct. Yeah,
And so I think when we talk about these issues at Denison Forum, I think it's always important to get that perspective, the perspective that in the first century, the culture that Jesus was working in was this kind of Hellenistic Roman culture, a very pagan culture, was where Christianity was born. And even when you talked about just now, talking about how the gates of hell won't stand against Christ and his followers, he's in Caesarea Philippi, I believe, and he's looking into what they believe was the literal gates of hell, into this spring that they could not measure the depths of. And so at that time, they believed maybe that was the literal gates to Hades in the culture. And that's where he made that proclamation. And I wonder if you could speak into, for Christians who are feeling a bit hopeless in such a turbulent time in our culture, both that perspective and then also why this time would be so ripe for a revival again, like the one that happened in Jesus Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And just to give a little perspective, because it can feel a little bleak these days. Certainly I've never been in a moment in my lifetime where, there's been this kind of hatred and division. But it has happened before, and we have been here before. And my daughter's 14. God help me as a dad. And so speaking on behalf of what I've observed about Gen Z and saying it as I think I'm called a geriatric millennial. I was year one. So we've gotten old. Anyway, I just believe in this generation. I believe in what God's going to do in this generation. And I noticed something when I began studying the Jesus movement. It was not a generation of these like bad kids that were doing their bad drugs that suddenly came to God. It was actually an incredibly astute, incredibly aware generation that were aware of their own need. Now that drove them to the wrong places first, and that's portrayed in the film. And so I love watching this film with college students and teenagers. They love it. It's really a film designed to bring generations together. A lot of times screens rip our families apart now. And I want to make content that brings our families together. So it's a great film to watch with teenagers. Teenagers actually love it. I watched it at the premiere with my wife, my daughter, and my parents, and we were all enjoying it for different reasons because everybody's coming in through a different character. But the love story with these teenagers is really front and center. And for that reason, high school and college students really love the film, uniquely of any film we've made. And so do their parents. And we designed it that way because we want this film to be a conversation. And so I think a big part, of that time was I learned through study the difference between these two words, spiritual awakening and revival. I thought when I started this journey that those were the same thing. Well, come to find out they're not. Revival is something that happens in the church. Spiritual awakening is something that happens in culture. And if you pray for spiritual awakening, get ready to be disrupted. Get ready for your life to be disrupted. Because back then, there was suddenly a generation that, for whatever reason, was aware of their own need, their own spiritual vacuum, and the fact that this sort of materialistic quest of their parents was not enough. And they were a generation searching, it's what we say in the film, searching for all the right things in all the wrong places. So sort of the quest of free love, drugs, rock and roll, and what we talk about in the film of the quest of LSD was sort of this way to find God. And they had to get to the end of that. And they had to realize that didn't work to then, that's why they said Jesus is the real drug back then. It's basically, they're like, we finally found what works. And I think a generation today, that is what has returned. You have which it wasn't Pew. It was, anyway, one of the research groups did this study that there is a sudden rise in spiritual hunger and curiosity in America. So even though church attendance is declining, people are spiritually hungry and they're aware of their own vacuum and they're like, what is the answer? We thought social media would connect us. In many ways, social media is sort of like what LSD was back then, like this thing that was supposed to connect us and make us feel a certain way, and it doesn't, and it just leaves us empty. And so now they're saying, sort of what's the answer? And so I just really believe in this generation being very similar to that generation of just being very spiritually aware and very spiritually attuned, and being very attuned to what's authentic and what's not. And I think that that's a huge opportunity. And I do think one of the verses that I put in the movie when we first meet Kelsey and he's in this church of 30 people, he says this. He holds up this magazine, "Is God Dead?" which was Time Magazine, 1967. He's like, and he basically is just like, "This, it's over. This is the end," which is in many ways the attitude we have. And there's this verse in Matthew where he says, "He who endures to the end shall be saved." Which I think growing up Baptist can be sort of like the attitude. But if you keep reading your Bible, it says this gospel of the kingdom will go to all nations, to all people as a testimony, and then the end will come. And it was in context of Jesus' disciples saying, "What's the sign of the end of the times?" or whatever. And I think I would encourage everyone to just zoom out a little bit. And Jesus tells his disciples to get this message. It's the first to-do list of Christianity, the Great Commission to the whole world. Well, the continent we're on wouldn't be discovered for like 1400 plus years, And so in this distance medley relay of Christianity, and yeah, it's bad, but we're not the pre-show in the gladiator events getting eaten by lions. So it was certainly worse then, and every generation has led to a moment in time where our generation is the first generation that can reasonably say this thing, the Great Commission, could happen in our lifetime. We could get the gospel to the entire world. So the fact that we're not jumping up and down over that, and the fact that we're not getting after it, each in our own lanes and our own crafts, is frustrating to me, because we are in such a unique time to get this message around the world by harnessing mediums like radio, television, mass entertainment. Whenever there's been a sweeping move of God, there's always been some sort of technological innovation that's made communication easier, whether that was the printing press or radio or television or railroads even. And so we're just in a time of accelerated innovation technology that enables us to get this message out. And I just think we need to change our attitude and the way we think about ourselves. I think in many ways Christianity is like, that elephant at the circus. When it's a baby, they tie its foot to a pole with a rope. And then when that elephant's grown, they'll tie that elephant with a string to a pole, and it'll stay right there because it's trapped in its own mind and its own paradigms. We're far more powerful than we think. And when we unify our voice, amazing things happen. And I would encourage us to change our perspective at a very unique moment in history. And it's bad, certainly. America is struggling. And look, I say this, my grandfather is a Medal of Honor recipient. I love this country, but it's the greatest idea in the history of nations. And we're stewards of it. And it's amazing, but it's not the kingdom of God, Mm-hmm. And I just think that if we just set our minds on, okay, let's get this message of hope to the entire world in our time. Let's embrace that we have more tools than ever to do that. And let's embrace that God can work in a generation just like he has at similar moments. The beautiful thing about the problems in our country and things that we cover in the film is as I did the research on Jesus Revolution, the word that came up the most was the word desperate. It was just a desperate time. And we had to be driven to our knees as a nation for God to show up. And so I think a lot of what's going on now is a good thing, and we should embrace it. But I feel much more optimistic about the times in which we live. I think God's going to work in my daughter's generation. I think God's going to use us to get the gospel to the world. And I think it's time that we take a mindset of offense and we replace pessimism with optimism and hope, and we get after it, in our time. It's not as bad as we think.
Yeah, so well said. Yeah, and that's one of the things I found in the movie, I've heard about a number of these figures for a long time, Chuck Smith and Greg Laurie, obviously, and learned a lot about Lonnie Frisbee that I didn't know. And it's just, great job of paralleling the desperation that came from what you might call the Woodstock side of things, where so many people went down that road and got stuck and never came out of that drug culture and that type of thing. And then this other movement, it's almost like there was an imposter movement going on at the same time that the Jesus movement was emerging, or the imposter movement gave rise to the authentic movement of the Jesus Revolution. But in the midst of this, Mark or John, in the few minutes that we have left, is there a scene, one or two scenes that are just your favorite? I would have my favorite in
Oh yeah,
picking this,
yeah,
and I related to this in so many ways. I was 9, 10 years old when all of this was unfolding in the early 70s. I had older siblings that were kind of caught up in different pieces of this. I recognized the things that they wore, the car that they drove. And even last year here in Dallas, there was a commemorative event at the Cotton Bowl for Expo
yeah. Nick did
72.
that. Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
yeah. And so connecting to it in that way. But is there a couple of parts of the film, couple of scenes that are just absolutely your favorite? Because even though it tells the story of Chuck Smith, Lonnie, Greg Laurie, it's really much bigger than that. The story is much bigger than just those characters.
Yeah.
But what's your favorite part of the
Yeah,
movie?
and so I do have a favorite scene and a favorite moment. I think it's a career favorite that I can explain in a minute. But one of the themes that I do love that you touched on, it's not the Lonnie Frisbee movie, it's not the Chuck Smith movie, it's not the Greg Laurie movie, it's the Jesus movement, it's the Jesus Revolution movie. So I love the story of these characters, none of which are perfect, being caught up in a perfect moment in time,
Yes.
and God
Yep.
uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And just to touch on it, Lonnie, post this story in the Jesus movement, went to Florida. He just wrestled with things that he said he was wounded as a child, stayed wounded his whole life, and he got bitter, felt like he was used. We cover it in the film a little bit. So it felt like he was sort of used as a spark, and then people would cast him aside, and had real problems with father figures. And so after he helped launch the Vineyard movement in the 80s, he sort of fell away in Rio for a time, and then came back in repentance, and ended up dying of AIDS. And so for a long time, he was sort of written out of the Jesus movement because of struggles that he had later on. And first of all, that's revisionist history. That's not accurate. He was substantively a part of it. I think so many of us sit back and think, God can't use me because I've done this or that. I struggle with this or that. I'm not talented enough, whatever it is. And I really wanted to challenge that notion. The next story that I'm launching into is David from the Bible. And so I think that talk about a complex, flawed character that God used greatly. And I just think we need to understand that, yes, there's consequences to things that we do, and sometimes those consequences can be hurtful. Sometimes they can cut a life short, but that does not mean that God can't use us. And so I think a lot of people feel a certain sense of either disqualified or unqualified, so they stay on the sidelines of Christianity. One of the reasons I made this movie is to really challenge that notion. Like, we all have a role to play, we all have a gift, we all have a story, and God is the master worker of taking things and redeeming them, and taking some things that we do and actually turning them into our testimony, into our story. And there's very, very few that God can redeem any story. And so that's a huge part of the film, and a huge part that I'm passionate about. My favorite scene in the movie, and probably in my career, is this baptism scene right in the center of the movie, in the middle of the movie. And we filmed the movie 4 weeks in the coast of Alabama, and then we went to California for 6 days to film in the actual locations. In this magazine, this Jesus Revolution magazine, there's a ton of photography, as there was in Life magazine, Look magazine, of Pirates Cove. It really was this sacred place where there was these mass baptisms. There were so many people that wanted to get baptized, they had to go to the ocean. Pirates Cove is a very difficult location to film in because it's like this crescent moon. It's jagged rocks. You have to go up and over. So for a film crew, it's terrible. So, there was one thought that we could film it on any beach anywhere, but I really felt we should go back to the actual location where all this happened, and we should match it. And that's exactly what we did. And I've never felt such spiritual power on the set of a movie. It takes miracles to make any movie, but we had like 500 extras there, 300 to 500, depending on the day. And Greg Laurie put Kelsey Grammer and Jonathan Rumi through sort of baptism school. There's all these things that you don't know, like you can throw your back out if you're not deep enough, and Greg actually wrote and taught Jonathan the salvation prayer that's in the movie. It wasn't in the script; it just said they prayed in the script, and we filmed it. Jonathan Rumi prayed for a heat wave because it was in March in LA in the Pacific Ocean, and there was a heat wave. I'm like, shouldn't have prayed that hard, which was a miracle. And Jonathan, who's quite the method actor, came up out of the water and just said, man, I'm doing it just like Greg taught me. I'm doing it exactly like he taught me, but this is not acting. Like I've had like 5 people that are saying, I want to be baptized for real right now. Will you really baptize me? And people were making real decisions for Christ. Then we had another Calvary Chapel pastor in the water, and he came up and he's like, I'm telling you, God's Spirit is here, and if we just stop this and have a service, there will be a huge response. I'm like, we can't do that. The sun's setting. We're making a movie, man. But it was like it was just in the air. It was unbelievable. And then Greg Laurie, while we're dramatizing this baptism, talk about life imitating art and vice versa. With Jonathan and Joel, the real Greg Laurie, there was a cast member who hadn't acted for 14 years, had a real bad drug problem, was trying to get a SAG card again. He was in the Mighty Ducks, and great guy, and had a drug problem that almost killed him a few times. And Greg was having a conversation with him, and without any of us even knowing it was happening, baptizing him like 300 feet away from where we were dramatizing the scene. So it was, and you feel it in the movie. I think you feel that power in that scene in the movie. That's exactly what we felt on the day. And I felt like we touched the Jesus movement a little bit, like we felt it a little bit. And oddly enough, it was the same feeling in the air. I can't explain it. It was just, that I felt when my wife and I drove over to Asbury University on day 3 of that revival and just sat in Hughes Auditorium. It was the exact same feeling. And it's really, really cool. So it just gave me great hopes that if it happened once, it can happen again. So, we all have our gifts and we all use our gifts. I'm an entertainer. I'm a storyteller. And so the best we can do is just to tell. I've heard it said that the fame of revival spreads the flame of revival. So we can just tell the story and make it as entertaining and as fun and as funny and as meaningful as we can, but with the hopes that people will watch the movie and say, let's let this happen again. If I had one request, if there was ever a movie that I would ask you to take people to, it's this movie. It's designed for you to take people to it. I especially think about what I wrestle with the most. As a dad, I feel like Jerry Maguire. What's that line in Jerry Maguire when he says, "You see this jacket? You want it? I don't need it because I'm cloaked in failure." Like, I just feel like all these influences, we're the first parents that are dealing with platforms at scale in our homes. And so it's just this flood of influence in our homes, and you just feel completely disconnected from your kids. And so I would just say to those parents with teenage kids, take them to this movie and talk to them afterward. I guarantee you it will work because it worked for me with my daughter. And so go see the movie. It's in theaters right now, substantively this weekend, or early screenings right now. And let's all pray together that God can do this again.
Absolutely. Yeah. And who knows, right? Sometimes we talk about the whole world is in God's hands, but his fingerprints are at certain places. Maybe Asbury is one of those places. Maybe Pirates Cove is one of those places. It's just sacred ground, even though it's got a name like Pirates Cove.
Yeah.
It's just sacred ground where God does some of his most special work. But, John, one of our goals at Denison Forum and the Denison Forum podcast is to just shine a light on where God is at work. And we really trust and believe that God is at work in this environment and in the environment of film and storytelling that you and your brother are in. And just, again, thank you for what you've done and what you are doing. And thank you for letting us be a part of telling the story in a little bit. And so important that our audience go and see this movie. And like you said, take people with them. And that will serve a lot of purposes, not the least of which being, hopefully, being a catalyst to the next awakening, the next Jesus revolution and revival within the church. We want to see both, not either or, but see both. And we're just grateful for your time and grateful for the attention of people that are listening to this podcast. And if this has been helpful to you today, Please rate, review us on your podcast platform. Share it with others. Please share it with others, and go see the movie and enjoy the popcorn. It's going to be a great, great
Your
opportunity
wife loves it.
for
So
you.
does mine. Yeah, it's
That's right.
Yeah, God bless you guys. I hope you enjoy the film. It's my favorite film ever to watch with an audience. It's just a wonderful. It's an experience full of joy when you watch it with people, and I hope you enjoy it. And it is in theaters. And thank you for helping get the word out. And I just think, be encouraged. Most of all, God is on the move. He's on the move.
Absolutely.
In our country. He's on the move in the entertainment industry. He's on the move in the world. He's working in a generation, and I think I dare you to be optimistic. Is my sort of word to Christians everywhere. Like it's not as bad as we think, and God's going to show up, I think, in a really big way, and we're going to all get to be a part of it. So God bless you guys. Enjoy the movie.